Ever since 1945, we've lived in a world where nuclear weapons have been hanging over both our domestic and foreign affairs. There are currently around 13,000 nuclear weapons in use, owned by 9 different countries. Most of the time, we live our lives without thinking about the fact that we live in a world where a few key decision makers could obliterate civilization several times over in the span of a few hours. But every so often, we're forced to face that reality. With the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're now in one such moment. A new APA poll published this month reports that 70% of Americans are worried about nuclear attack. Given this widespread concern, it felt like a good time to dedicate an episode to discussing the impact that nuclear weapons have on our world today. Here to discuss are visiting Associate Professor of History, Barry Jackisch, and Associate Professor of Political Science, Joel Voss. Both of you have been on the show before, so welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I'm going to start here with kind of a large question, and I'm going to go to the paper here to make sure I get these numbers right. But I mentioned at the top of the show that there are 13,000 nuclear weapons in operation, and the U.S. is in possession of about 5,500 of these. A declassified study from the Los Alamos lab determined it would take about 100 large nuclear weapons to end civilization as we know it. So based on my calculations, the U.S. alone could end civilization 50 times over. Just the insanity of that, just let it sink in. And how have we gotten ourselves in this predicament?
Well, if you look at the historical background to this, we go back to the last several years and then the immediate post-war period of World War II. And as all of your viewers probably know, the U.S. for a brief period of time was the sole nuclear power. And as World War II came to an end, the U.S. pursued a number of different approaches to try to hold on to that monopoly. There's an interesting history about the actual raw material, how uranium, which is essential to the process of developing nuclear weapons, became central to both the United States and other countries that were interested in pursuing nuclear programs. And so something like resources became important after that. Mm-hmm. But if we go to the question of why the United States and the former Soviet Union, specifically now we say the Russian Federation, why they have such a large percentage overall, has in part to do with the development of those weapons. They were the first 2 powers. The Soviet Union initiated its first nuclear test in August of 1949, so only a few years after the end of the war. And this created a sort of mutually reinforcing process whereby the United States and the Soviet Union ended up competing with each other, developing ever more powerful in terms of their yield or their load, how explosive the weapons were. And also, we need to keep in mind when we talk about nuclear weapons, we also need to remember that it is not just the bomb itself, it is also the myriad of delivery systems that allow these countries to actually get them there. So we often talk about the nuclear triad, the ability of long-range ICBM missiles to deliver nuclear weapons, bombers, and usually submarines that are an essential part of that. Not every nation could develop those kinds of weapons on the scale that they were developed in the immediate post-war period. And so from a very early position, historically, the US and the Soviet Union were at the forefront of that development.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in just doing research for this. I mean, there's such a big drop-off. It's like Russia has, 6,000 some, US 5,000. Then you drop all the way to China and it's 350 or so. And then there's a big drop-off after that as well. But it seems to me like there's a redundancy issue after a few of them, right? I mean, what is the impact of having 5,500 that having 4,500 doesn't do for you, or 3,500?
Well, it's a security dilemma, right? It's a race to make sure that you have more or better weapons than your opponent, right? And so, yeah, it may seem redundant, right? But if you go back to the Cold War and think about how we thought about the Cold War, everything was a fight against communism, right? Or if you're on the other side, capitalism. So in that sense, it makes sense. And I would just point out that the US and Russian stockpiles are decreasing, right? But other countries are increasing, very slowly increasing their stockpiles. So it's something to also think about, right? We have 9 countries that have them. And some of those countries, 4 or 5 of them, are increasing their stockpiles.
Well, what has been kind of the impact of, having a couple generations of these? Like, how has that affected our international relations? And I ask this specifically because some people make the argument that we've lived in a safer world because of these nuclear weapons, because countries are less likely to get into kind of traditional skirmishes for fear that things would escalate and the costs are too great. Does that line of thinking make sense to you?
It makes sense to me when we're thinking about the Cold War, right? We thought a lot about mutually assured destruction. But recent theory and evidence is questioning whether that still holds. For example, perhaps if two countries have nuclear weapons and they know the cost of using them is so great, they can escalate at a lower level with different types of artillery or strategies, et cetera, because they're not really worried about nuclear weapons being used. And we may be seeing that with Russia and Ukraine. In other words, nuclear weapons might give countries a defense to still be hostile.
Yeah, and I think you're talking there about, some kind of changing assumptions that we might have to make, based on this kind of current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I mean, I think one thing that's really surprised a lot of people is Putin's refusal to kind of rule out the use of nuclear weapons, even in kind of a first strike capacity. Like just paint a little context for us there about what is that likely going to do to international relations and kind of how we think about nuclear weapons in the future?
So this changed in 2020 with a kind of reshuffling of Russian doctrine about how and in what scenarios, in theory, nuclear weapons could be used. And one of the important things for your viewers to keep in mind here is that when we talk at this table about nuclear weapons in general, there is a very wide range of the types of weapons and delivery systems that we're talking about. So one of the kind of traditional distinctions that has been made has to do with strategic, meaning much longer range, perhaps 3,000-4,000 mile range in missiles and in bombers with very heavy megaton level delivery loads, as opposed to what are called tactical nuclear weapons. So for example, the ability of an artillery battery, say in Ukraine, to fire instead of a conventional explosive shell, a smaller yield nuclear shell out of an artillery piece on the battlefield. And so in that regard, it gets us into the question of doctrine. How do various countries see the feasibility of using nuclear weapons in certain scenarios? And you mentioned in the case of Russia and the war in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin made it very clear soon after the invasion that Russia was escalating, putting an increased readiness over its nuclear forces. Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has emphasized the fact that Russia does not preclude the idea that using nuclear weapons is off the table or impossible. And so one of the things we need to remember with that is various nations view how nuclear weapons are used, and Dr. Voss and I were talking about this before, in a defensive or an offensive way, and how nations view the use of nuclear weapons is tremendously important to understand and is not the same from country to country. So we need to remember that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting segue to something you were saying earlier, Joel, kind of talking about how the stockpiles dropping for U.S. and Russia, but increasing in other countries. So, I mean, it seems in a conversation about nuclear weapons, you have to talk about North Korea, for example. And I know some folks think Iran is trying to procure a nuclear weapon as well. And as more and more countries get nuclear weapons, currently there's 9, and especially when they start falling more in the hands of kind of autocratic leadership, like how is that going to shift the power of balance kind of in our world today?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it would shift the balance of power in the world, right? And certainly Iran, I think, wants to get nuclear weapons in large part because they can't trust the United States. There's been a long history of hostility between both the United States and Iran. I'm actually less worried about authoritarian regimes getting nuclear weapons than I'm worried about unstable regimes getting nuclear weapons, right? So if you're an authoritarian regime that is quite stable, I'm a little less concerned about it. What if you're a democracy, though, that is appearing a little less stable? Stability is really, I think, what matters there, right? Because we don't want nuclear weapons to get in the hands of potential terrorists or accidents or any sort of other thing, right?
So when you're talking about like instability there, like what are those, like why instability? What about that would lead us to some of those negative outcomes?
Well, let's say that Russia collapsed right now, right? That would be very bad for our ability to defend ourselves against nuclear weapons getting out, or even uranium or other chemicals, right, to get out. So it's stability is a good thing sometimes, regardless of the type of regime we're talking about.
Well, we're about at the end of our time here, but real quickly, I think Albert Einstein is reported to have said, I don't know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. Just curious, as a historian and a political scientist, how that strikes you.
Well, I'll say very quickly, one of the hallmarks of any kind of nuclear doctrine, whatever country it is, there is probably a premium on escalation. And so any use of nuclear weapons, whether on a small scale battlefield level or certainly an international strategic level, the possibility for rapid escalation and terrible destruction is significant.
Oh, well, it's a great note to end on here. But I really appreciate you both being here, a very important conversation, and one that's certainly kind of evolving quickly. Thank you very much for joining us on Rocket Talk. We'll see you next time.